He worked 20 years in the Dubai sun and came home with enough money to finally buy the house on the hill his mother used to point at when he was a boy. But the first thing Anthony saw when he landed was his mother on the cathedral steps, sitting with the beggars. What had happened to every remittance he sent? And why, when he finally learned the truth, did he stop being angry? Anthony Okafor left a small town in southeastern Nigeria at 31 years old with 2 suitcases and a construction foreman's certificate. He spent 2 decades building towers in the desert and wiring money home every single month without missing once. His mother Angela raised him alone, and he had promised her something better. The question was never whether the money arrived. The question was what happened to it after it did, and what Anthony would do when he discovered that the person who lost it was also the person who needed him most. To understand what Anthony came home to, you have to understand what he left behind and what leaving cost him. He grew up in Enugu State, the only child of a woman who cleaned other people's houses 6 days a week and still managed to press his school uniform every morning. Angela Okafor was not a woman who complained. She was a woman who pointed. On the walk to his primary school, there was a house on a ridge above the town, pale yellow walls, a red iron roof, a garden that caught the afternoon light like it had been arranged for a photograph. She would point at it sometimes, not wistfully, not with hunger, more the way a teacher points at a diagram. That is what sustained effort produces, she would say. Remember that. Anthony remembered everything. He finished his studies, took a construction apprenticeship, worked 4 years on local builds, and qualified as a site foreman by 28. The day he received his WA work permit, Angela cooked a meal large enough for 20 people and invited the whole street. He flew out of Lagos 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning. Angela stood at the airport barrier until he was completely out of sight. He did not look back because he knew if he did, he would not be able to keep walking. Dubai in the early 2000s was building itself upwards so fast that skilled foreign labor was not just welcome, it was essential. Anthony was precise, calm under pressure, and he had a foreman's instinct for problems before they became disasters. He moved up steadily, site foreman to project coordinator to construction manager. By his 12th year, he was overseeing residential tower projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars and managing teams of more than 300 workers from a dozen countries. He sent money home every month, without exception. The first remittance went out 10 days after his first paycheck. The amounts grew as his salary grew. Over 20 years, by his own careful accounting, he transferred the equivalent of more than $240,000 to Nigeria. More than enough, he calculated, to buy the yellow house on the ridge. More than enough to make sure Angela never cleaned another person's floor. But Anthony had a practical problem. He was in Dubai. Angela was elderly, not particularly comfortable with banks, and the infrastructure for international transfers into her hands directly was not always reliable. So he set up a system. His wife Ifeoma had an account at a reputable Lagos bank. The money came in there. Ifeoma's brother, Paul Eze, was a businessman with local connections and, by all appearances, a man who understood money. He would manage the transfers, keep records, make sure Angela received her monthly portion, and that the rest was held safely until Anthony came home. It was a reasonable arrangement. Families like his built these systems all the time. You needed someone on the ground. You needed someone who understood the local systems. You needed someone you could trust. Paul presented himself as all three. He was 43 when Anthony left, broad-shouldered, quick with a handshake, the kind of man who arrived at every gathering slightly overdressed and slightly louder than necessary. He had run a small import business, a property rental, and briefly a vehicle fleet operation. None of these had made him rich, but none had visibly failed him either. He spoke the language of investment with the fluency of a man who had spent a long time around money without actually accumulating much of it. Anthony found this reassuring. Ambition, he thought, was a good quality in the man managing your savings. For the first several years, the system appeared to work. Angela received her monthly amount. She confirmed it on the phone, always cheerful, always redirecting the conversation to Anthony's health and whether he was eating properly. Paul sent quarterly summaries, typed documents showing balances, transactions, the growing pool of funds sitting in an account designated for Anthony's return. The numbers made sense. The pattern was consistent. Anthony did not have reason to look closely. He was working 14-hour days building towers in the desert. He trusted the documents because the documents had always arrived. He trusted Paul because Paul was family. In 2019, a large-scale residential housing development in the outskirts of Lagos collapsed. Not a building, the project itself. The developer had been undercapitalized, the permits had been obtained through connections rather than compliance, and when the regulatory environment tightened under a new state government, the entire development froze mid-construction. Investors lost everything. Several of them were individuals like Paul, men who had moved money quietly into a project that promised returns and delivered rubble. Paul lost the equivalent of $160,000 in that collapse. It was not his money. It was Anthony's. Paul did not tell anyone. Not Anthony. Not Ifeoma. Not Angela. What he did instead was something that required more calculation than courage. He kept sending the quarterly summaries. He kept the figures consistent. He adjusted the numbers each quarter to reflect a balance that no longer existed. A pool of savings that had been buried under a construction site on the Lagos periphery. He fabricated the statements carefully, not sloppily, not obviously. Carefully, with the kind of attention a man gives to something he is deeply afraid of. He kept this going for 6 years. Anthony, meanwhile, was counting down. He had set a return date in his mind and moved it forward twice, once for a contract extension, once for a project that needed him through completion. But by the spring of this year, he was done. He had savings of his own in Dubai that Paul had not touched. Money Anthony had kept separately, quietly, as what he called his landing fund. He calculated that between his landing fund and the accumulated transfers, he had more than enough. He booked his flight. He told Angela he was coming home for good. He did not tell her about the house on the ridge. He wanted that to be the moment he handed her the keys. He landed on a Wednesday morning, cleared customs, and took a taxi directly into town. He had arranged to meet Paul at a restaurant to review accounts before anything else. But Paul did not answer his phone that morning. He did not answer it that afternoon. Anthony went to his mother's house instead. The house was locked. A neighbor told him that Angela sometimes spent her mornings at the cathedral downtown, that she went most days, that she had been going for years. He thought nothing of it. Angela had always been devout. He took another taxi to the cathedral, climbed the wide front steps, and stopped. His mother was sitting at the base of the steps with her back against the stone, sharing food from a plastic container with a woman beside her who wore the same clothes she had worn the week before and the week before that. Angela looked smaller than he remembered. Her shoes were old. The container she was sharing from was the kind you bring when you do not know if the other person will have eaten. Anthony stood at the top of those steps and felt everything he had built over 20 years rearrange itself into a question he did not yet have the answer to. Where had the money gone? He did not run down the steps. He stood there for a moment the way you stand when your mind is processing something faster than your body can follow. Then he walked down slowly, and when Angela looked up and saw him, her face did something he had not seen it do in 20 years. She went still. Not with shock exactly. More the way a person goes still when something they have been quietly dreading finally arrives in physical form. She stood up. She was smaller than he remembered. He had been preparing for that, had told himself to expect it. He was not prepared for it. He held her for a long time without speaking. The woman beside her on the steps watched this with the patient attention of someone who has seen many things on those steps and does not make assumptions about any of them. When Anthony finally stepped back and looked at his mother, his first question was practical and controlled. Are you all right? Are you eating? Do you have what you need? Angela said yes. She said all three. She said it in the particular way that mothers say yes when they mean the question is the wrong one, but they do not want to trouble you with a better one. He asked her to come have tea with him. She said she would, in a little while. She turned and placed the remaining food from the container carefully at the side of the woman on the steps. She spoke to her quietly, in a tone Anthony could not quite hear. The woman nodded. They walked to a tea shop 2 streets over and sat across from each other at a small table. Anthony looked at his mother. He asked where she was living. She told him. A room at the back of a parishioner's house, not far from the cathedral. Clean, dry, warm enough. She had been there for 3 years. He asked who had arranged it. She said the parish had helped. The priest had known of a family with a spare room. It had worked out. Anthony put both hands flat on the table. He asked about the remittances. He told her the amount he had been sending every month for 20 years. He asked how much of it she had received. Angela was quiet for a moment. She said she had received her portion. A monthly amount. Enough to live on, she said carefully. Not much more than that. He asked what had happened to the rest. She said she had assumed Paul was saving it. That was the arrangement. She said Paul had come to her once, perhaps 4 years ago, and told her that there had been some delays with the account, some restructuring, that it would be sorted. He had brought her a small amount of cash that visit. He had seemed nervous. She had not pressed him because pressing was not her way, and because she did not want to cause trouble in the family. Anthony sat with that for a moment. Then he paid for the tea, walked outside, and called Paul. Paul answered this time. The conversation was short, and by any measure devastating. Paul did not deny it. He did not try to construct an alternative story. He had perhaps known this conversation was eventually coming, had perhaps been rehearsing it in the way that people rehearse confessions they have been postponing for years. He told Anthony what had happened. The housing development. The investment. The collapse in 2019. He said the word sorry several times. He said he had intended to recover it. He said he had believed at the time that the project was sound. Anthony asked about the quarterly statements, the typed documents with the running balances, the transaction histories. Paul was quiet. Then he said that he had prepared those himself, that the figures on them were not real. Anthony ended the call. He stood on the pavement outside the tea shop in the afternoon heat of a city that had changed significantly in 20 years. And he did the arithmetic he had been dreading since the steps of the cathedral. $160,000, minimum, gone, not mismanaged, not complicated. Gone, buried in a collapsed development on the outskirts of Lagos, lost in 2019. And concealed from him with fabricated paperwork for 6 years while he sent more money in and trusted the documents that arrived, confirming it was safe. The yellow house on the ridge would have cost $70,000 at current prices. He had sent more than 3 times that amount, and almost none of it remained. But here is where the story stopped being about money. Because Anthony's first instinct, which he will tell you was wrong, was to understand the full picture before he reacted to any part of it. He had managed construction projects with 300 people for 2 decades. He knew that the worst decisions came from acting on incomplete information. So before he drove to Paul's house, before he called a lawyer, before he did anything else, he went to the parish office near the cathedral. He needed to understand what had actually happened to his mother over the past several years, how she had ended up on those steps, what she had been going without. The parish secretary, a woman named Sister Bridget, who had worked that office for 31 years and who had the precise recall of someone who had been paying attention to human situations for most of her adult life, knew exactly who Angela Okafor was. She knew her by name. She knew her by face. She knew which mass she attended and which pew she preferred. She also knew something Anthony did not. She said, gently but without hesitation, that Angela was not in need, that she had a room, comfortable and consistent, that the parish had helped to arrange, and that a generous parishioner had provided at minimal cost for 3 years. That Angela received a monthly amount that covered her needs. That she was, Sister Bridget said, one of the most regular and reliable members of the parish community. Anthony said he had seen her on the steps, sharing food, with a woman who appeared to be homeless. Sister Bridget nodded. She said she knew the woman. Her name was Grace. She had been sitting on those steps, on and off, for the better part of a decade. She had a complicated history, as Sister Bridget put it. Mental health, estrangement from family, the kind of accumulated difficulty that doesn't reduce to a single explanation. She had a place she could go to sleep, but she did not always go there. She ate what she was given. Anthony asked when his mother had started bringing her food. Sister Bridget thought about it. She said she believed it had started about 4 years ago, that Angela had come to the steps one morning and found Grace there, and that Angela had given her the lunch she had brought for herself. And then she had come back the next morning with 2 portions. And then the morning after that. And the morning after that. Sister Bridget said she had once asked Angela why she came every day without fail, even in the rainy season, even when she herself was unwell. Angela had said something that Sister Bridget had written down because she felt it deserved to be written down. She had said, "I used to eat alone for 10 years after my son left. I know what that feels like. I don't want her to feel it." Anthony sat in a chair in the parish office and looked at the floor for a long time. This was not a story about neglect. His mother was not suffering from poverty in any immediate, urgent sense. She had shelter. She had enough. The monthly amount she received had been reduced by Paul's management, yes, but she had adapted to it with the quiet competence she had applied to every constraint in her life. What she was doing on those steps was not a symptom of abandonment. It was a choice, a deliberate, daily, 4-year choice to sit beside a woman who would otherwise eat alone. Because Angela Okafor had spent 10 years eating alone herself and had decided that if she could prevent that for someone else, she would. Anthony drove to Paul's house that evening. He went alone. He told no one where he was going. He sat across from his brother-in-law in a room that was smaller than Anthony remembered and had less furniture than he would have expected from a man who had been managing a significant pool of capital. Paul looked the way people look when they have been carrying something too heavy for too long and have finally been permitted to set it down, even if the setting down is painful. He looked like a man who had been exhausted by his own secret. They talked for 2 hours. Anthony asked questions in the methodical way he asked about construction faults, not with anger, with structure. He wanted to understand exactly what had happened, in sequence, with specifics. Paul provided all of it: the development company's name, the amount invested, the date the project froze. The date Paul understood the money was unrecoverable. The date he had first produced a false summary. The date he had decided not to tell anyone. Anthony asked one question toward the end of the 2 hours that Paul was not expecting. He asked not what Paul had done, but what Paul had believed would happen eventually. What he had imagined the end of this would look like. Paul was quiet for a long time. Then he said he had believed he would find a way to replace it before Anthony came home. He had believed that for 6 years. He had not found a way. He had run out of time. Anthony looked at him. He did not say what he was thinking. He said he needed a few days before he said anything further. Paul nodded. He looked like a man who had been sentenced to something and was waiting to hear the term. But the drive back, Anthony was not thinking about Paul. He was thinking about a woman on a set of cathedral steps sharing food from a plastic container. He was thinking about his mother saying, "I don't want her to feel it." He was thinking about 20 years of remittances and the house on the ridge, and the arithmetic of everything he had lost. And somewhere in the middle of all that, a different question was beginning to form. Not who was responsible, not how he could recover what was gone. Something quieter than that, something harder. He pulled over on a side street and sat with the engine off for a while, looking at nothing. The street was ordinary. A dog crossed at the far end. A child's shoe lay in the gutter. The evening was coming in the way evenings come in that part of the country, slowly the light turning amber before it turned dark. He thought, the money is gone, and Paul cannot give it back. And Angela is on those steps every morning, not because she was abandoned, but because she chose to be. Which means the story I came home to tell is not the story that is actually here. And that was the moment everything began to move in a different direction. He went home to the apartment he had rented for his return and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. He wrote down every number he could verify. Total transferred over 20 years. Monthly amount Angela confirmed receiving. Estimated total Angela received across those years. Difference, he was a construction manager. He had spent 20 years reconciling budgets. He was good at this. The number at the bottom of the page did not change no matter how many times he looked at it. The following morning, he made an appointment with a lawyer who specialized in civil financial disputes. A woman named Chioma Adeze, who had an office near the commercial district and who came recommended by a colleague of Anthony's from the Dubai days, who had needed her services after a different kind of family loss. She had a reputation for being direct, which was what Anthony needed. He did not need comfort. He needed to understand his legal position with precision. The meeting lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. The news was not good, but it was also not complicated. Paul had not stolen the money in the legal sense most useful to Anthony. He had made an investment decision with funds under his management. The investment had failed, and he had concealed that failure. Whether the concealment constituted fraud under Nigerian law was a question Chioma could investigate. But the practical reality, she said without apology, was this: Paul did not have the money. It was not sitting somewhere, transferred to a hidden account, converted into property or assets Anthony could trace and recover. It had been placed into a development company that no longer existed in any meaningful legal form. The company's assets had been seized by creditors years ago. The principal investors were scattered. There was no entity to sue that had funds to pay a judgment. She said it clearly and without softening it, even if Anthony pursued every legal avenue available to him. The probability of recovering a significant portion of that money was very low, and the timeline for any recovery would be years. She did not recommend the investment of time or legal fees unless the goal was punishment rather than restitution. Anthony asked whether Paul could be prosecuted criminally for the falsified statements. Chioma said possibly. That the fabricated documents were a serious matter. But she also said that prosecution would cost Anthony time, energy, and money, and that Paul's financial position made any order of restitution from a criminal proceeding largely symbolic. Anthony thanked her, paid for the consultation, and walked out into the street. He was not angry in the way that surprises you. He was angry in the way that confirms something you already understood was true. The money was gone. Paul could not give it back. The law could punish Paul, but could not undo what had happened. These were facts. He had always been better at working with facts than against them. What he did not yet know was that there was another layer to this, one that did not come from a lawyer's office. That evening, Ifeoma called him. He and Ifeoma had been married for 11 years. Their marriage had become, over time, a practical arrangement rather than a close one. The distance had not helped. Anthony had known this and had accepted it as one of the costs of the Dubai decision, a cost he intended to address when he came home. They had spoken by phone regularly across the years, but regularly and intimately are not the same thing. He had assumed she was an innocent party in what Paul had done. The money had gone into her account, yes, but Paul was the one who managed it. But Ifeoma's voice on the phone that evening carried something he recognized from 20 years of negotiations. She had been preparing what she was about to say. She had rehearsed it. She said she needed to tell him something. She said she had known, not everything, but something, for longer than she had admitted to herself. She said that 3 years ago, perhaps 4, she had asked Paul a direct question about the account balance after noticing that the quarterly summaries seemed round in a way that real accounts were not. She said Paul had told her it was a formatting issue, that the underlying records were fine. She said she had believed him because she had wanted to. Anthony let the silence sit for a moment before he said anything. He asked her if she had ever looked at the actual account. She said she had not. She said her name was on the account, but Paul had handled all the banking. She said she had trusted him. Anthony asked her one more question. He asked when she had stopped trusting him. She said, about 2 years ago. She said she had not asked Paul about it again. She said she had told herself Anthony would be home soon and things would be sorted. Anthony said he understood. He said goodnight. He ended the call. He sat in the apartment for a long time afterward. He was thinking about the architecture of what had happened. Not just Paul's decision to invest and to lie about losing it, but the wider structure of avoidance that had surrounded that lie. Ifeoma, who had suspected and looked away. The quarterly summaries, received and filed without scrutiny. 20 years of phone calls with Angela during which he had never asked the specific questions that would have revealed the gap between what was sent and what she held. He had trusted the system he had built because trusting it was easier than checking it. He was not exempt from this. That was the part that required honesty. Now here is the part of this story that most people would not expect. Anthony spent 3 days consulting lawyers, reviewing documents, and methodically confirming what Kioma had told him. The money was genuinely gone, not hidden, not recoverable in any practical time frame. And on the 4th day, he stopped. He closed the notepad. He stopped making calls. Not because he had given up, because he had made a decision that was going to require all the energy that chasing Paul would otherwise consume. He went to see his mother. Angela's room was at the back of a house owned by a retired school teacher named Mrs. Mosu, a woman in her 70s who had known the parish for decades and who charged Angela almost nothing for a room that was small but had a window with morning light and a shelf for her things. It was not the kind of room you apologize for. It was cared for. Angela had a coverlet on the bed that Anthony recognized from childhood, one she had brought herself. On the shelf were photographs, several of Anthony at various ages, one of Anthony and Ifeoma at their wedding, one of Angela herself as a younger woman, standing in front of a building Anthony did not recognize, smiling in a way that had not yet been worn down by anything. He sat in the chair by the window. Angela sat on the edge of the bed. They talked for 3 hours. Real talking. The kind that had not happened across a phone line in 20 years. He told her everything he had learned, the amount that had been lost, Paul's role, the fabricated statements. He told her plainly because she deserved plainness. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said that she had not known the details, but that she had known. Somewhere she had known that things were not quite right. She said she had told herself not to worry Anthony while he was so far away. She said that had perhaps been a mistake. Anthony asked her about Grace. Angela's expression changed, not dramatically, a softening. She told him about the morning 4 years ago when she had come to the cathedral for early mass and found Grace sitting against the stone, and how she had sat down beside her because sitting down beside someone cost nothing and ignores cost everything. She said Grace had told her, across many mornings and many containers of food, that she had once had a family. That estrangement was a complicated word for something that had no good words. That she was not looking for rescue. That she was simply there. Angela said she had not tried to rescue Grace. She said Grace would not have wanted that. She had simply come back the next morning and the morning after that. She said Grace knew her name and the names of her grandchildren she had never met, and the name of the town Anthony grew up in. She said that Grace had never once asked for anything except the company. Anthony asked his mother if she had been happy. Angela looked at the window for a moment. She said happy was a word she was not sure she used correctly. She said she had been useful. She said those were not the same thing, but that being useful, genuinely useful to a specific person who needed exactly what you had to give, was one of the things that made a day feel worthwhile. Anthony drove away from Mrs. Mosu's house and parked at the edge of the road beneath a tree. He thought about everything his mother had said. He thought about Grace, a woman he had never met, who had been eating better for 4 years because Angela had decided that eating alone was something she understood and did not want to extend to anyone else if she could help it. He thought about the yellow house on the ridge. He had been building toward that house for 20 years. The idea of it. The image of Angela standing on its porch looking out at the town, finally in the place that had always seemed to belong to a different kind of life. He had wanted to give her that. He still did. But he was beginning to see that the thing he had wanted to give her was a symbol. And what she had built for herself, in the absence of what he was sending, was not a symbol. It was something real and specific and rooted in a woman who would never stop getting up in the morning and doing the next necessary thing. He could not recover the money. But the money had never been the actual point. That clarity, arriving that afternoon under a tree in the town where he was born, was the moment the story stopped being a story about loss and became a story about what you build when the original plan is gone. And what Anthony was beginning to imagine was something that would take everything he had brought back from Dubai, not to buy a house on a hill, to build something that had Angela's name on it in a different way, and Grace's name on it, and perhaps even Paul's name on it in a way that none of them would have predicted. He started the car. He drove back toward the cathedral. He wanted to look at the annex. The parish annex stood at the east side of the cathedral grounds, separated from the main building by a narrow passage. It was a single-story structure, perhaps 40 years old, built in the practical style of buildings that were intended to function rather than to impress. At some point, it had been used for after-mass gatherings, for catechism classes, for parish administration overflow. At some more recent point, it had stopped being used for anything. The windows on the western wall were clouded. The door had a padlock that had not been opened in long enough that the hinge had begun to rust. Anthony walked around it twice. He looked at the floor through the murky glass. He looked at the roof, which was corrugated iron, and appeared structurally intact from what he could judge from the outside. He stood at the back of the building, where a narrow concrete yard opened out, and measured the yard with his eyes the way someone measures a space when they are already imagining what it could hold. He had built towers. He had managed the construction of residential complexes that housed thousands of people. He knew what buildings needed. He also knew, in the specific way that people who have worked in construction for 20 years know things, when a structure's bones were still good. This one was. He went to find the priest. Father Emmanuel Obiora had served that parish for 16 years. He was a compact, deliberate man who listened in the way that people listen when they have heard a great many things and learned not to judge the speed at which they arrived. Anthony sat across from him in the vestry and laid out what he was thinking. He said he wanted to purchase or lease the annex, convert it into a functioning daily kitchen, open by 6 in the morning and running through the midday hour, available to anyone who came and asked for a meal. Father Obiora asked him what he was going to call it. Anthony said he had not decided the name yet. The priest said he had a suggestion. He said the woman who had been sitting on the steps of the cathedral for the better part of a decade was named Grace Amaka Obi. He said she had, to his knowledge, never had anything named after her in her life. He said names had weight. He said the right name on a door could be a kind of statement about what a building was actually for. Anthony sat with that for a moment. He said that was the name. The legal arrangements took 6 weeks. The diocese was cooperative. The annex was leased at a nominal rate with the understanding that the kitchen would serve the community broadly and without condition. Anthony hired a contractor he had vetted carefully, the kind of contractor who understood the difference between doing work quickly and doing it right, and the renovation took 11 weeks. The interior was opened up and replastered. The kitchen was fitted with commercial-grade equipment, a 6-burner range, 2 deep freezers, a preparation counter long enough for 4 people to work at simultaneously. The concrete yard at the back was swept clean and fitted with 2 long wooden tables and benches for outdoor seating in the dry season. On the door of the building, a painted sign in clean black letters, Grace's Kitchen. The kitchen opened on a Monday morning in the dry season. Angela was there before the doors opened. She had brought nothing except herself, which was notable to everyone who knew her, because she had been bringing things to that corner of the cathedral grounds every morning for 4 years. She stood inside the kitchen and looked at the preparation counter and the range and the long serving line, and then she looked at her son, and she did something she had not done in front of Anthony since he was a child. She wept. Not distress. The other kind. The kind that happens when something that has been held carefully for a long time is finally allowed to be set down. Grace Amaka Obi came at 7:15 that first morning. She came the way she always came, without announcement, without expectation. She sat at the outdoor table and was brought a plate of rice and stew and a cup of tea. She looked at the sign above the door for a long moment. She did not say anything about it. She ate her meal. When she was finished, she remained at the table in the morning light for another hour, not because she was waiting for something, but because she was in no hurry to leave and no one asked her to. Angela sat across from her. They talked about small things, a bird that had landed on the table and then reconsidered, the quality of the morning light, something Grace had heard on a neighbor's radio that she found interesting. Angela refilled Grace's cup without being asked. What had changed was not that Angela was now providing food to someone who had been eating irregularly. Grace had been eating, imperfectly but consistently, for 4 years, because Angela had made sure of it. What had changed was the scale. The stability. The fact that the thing Angela had been doing quietly and at personal cost was now a structure rather than a gesture. A building with her friend's name on it and a stove that would run every morning regardless of whether Angela had thought to bring something from home. Angela still came every day. She just no longer brought her own lunch to give away. Now for the part of this story that most people would not anticipate. In the second week after the kitchen opened, Anthony made a phone call to Paul. He did not call to confront him. He had done that. He did not call to forgive him, not in the formal ritualized sense that word is sometimes used. He called to offer him a job. The kitchen needed someone to manage the daily logistics. The supply chain, the vendor relationships, the accounting, the roster of volunteers who had signed up to help with preparation and service. It needed someone who understood how money moved, who could be trusted to do the administrative work without the kitchen becoming the kind of operation that exists on paper but functions poorly in practice. Anthony had considered several people for this role. He had thought about Paul for longer than he had expected to. Paul had managed accounts. He had managed vendor relationships in his earlier business operations. He knew how the local supply chains worked, which markets were reliable, which suppliers could be pressed for better terms on regular volume. He had skills that were real, even if they had been applied, in one critical instance, very badly. Anthony told him the pay was modest. He told him the hours were early. He told him the work was operational and not glamorous. He told him the kitchen fed people who had nothing, and that the accounting for every week would be reviewed by Anthony personally. He said, "I need someone who understands what it costs to lose something that belonged to someone else." Paul was silent for a moment. He said yes. He started the following Monday. He arrived before the kitchen opened and was still there when it closed. He sourced the produce. He handled the supplier accounts. He kept records that Anthony reviewed each week and found to be meticulous. He spoke to the volunteers with a specific kind of directness that worked well in operational settings. He was good at this. It turned out that what Paul was not good at was managing money that did not have sufficient oversight. Given the oversight, he functioned differently. He never told anyone why he had taken the job. Not his wife, not his sister, not the volunteers who worked alongside him, who knew him only as the logistics manager who arrived early and locked up carefully and kept the supply costs consistently under budget. He did not perform contrition. He did not explain himself. He simply came every morning and worked. Here is the final detail, the one that when Anthony told it, tended to stop a conversation. 3 months after the kitchen opened, Grace began coming in before the service started. Not every morning, but some mornings. She would arrive at 6:45 and find Paul in the preparation area and stand at the counter and ask what needed to be done. Paul would show her. She was not fast and she did not have a professional kitchen background, but she was careful and she learned quickly. She learned which prep tasks could be done in advance and which could not. She learned how to portion accurately. She learned that bread kept better covered and that rice required more water than most people assumed. She never asked for a formal role. She was never given one. She simply appeared and worked alongside the volunteers for the hours that suited her and then sat at the outdoor table afterward and ate what everyone else ate. One morning, about 3 weeks after she had started coming in early, She walked past the sign above the door on her way out. She stopped. She put her hand against the lettering. She stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then she walked on. Nobody watched this happen except Paul, who was in the doorway behind her. He did not say anything. He went back inside and continued the morning work. Angela told Anthony about it that evening. She had been sitting at the outdoor table and had seen it through the serving window. She told him the way she told most things, plainly and without editorial. Anthony said he was glad Grace was helping. Angela said she was glad Grace had somewhere to be. That, Anthony said later, was the sentence that clarified everything for him. Not somewhere to eat, somewhere to be. His mother had understood this before anyone else. It was why she had climbed those steps every morning for 4 years with 2 portions of food. Not to solve a problem, to give a person a place. The yellow house on the ridge was still up there, still pale against the sky, still catching the afternoon light the way it always had. Anthony drove past it sometimes. He had not moved to buy it. He was not sure he would. His mother did not live in it and did not seem to need it. She had a room with morning light and a shelf for her photographs and a building with a friend's name on the door that she walked to every morning with nothing in her hands. Some promises, Anthony was learning, get better when you change what they mean. There is a version of this story that ends with recovery, with lawyers and judgments and Paul paying back every dollar over 20 years in court-ordered installments, with Anthony standing on the porch of the yellow house, handing his mother a key while the afternoon light does exactly what it was always supposed to do. That version is tidier. It resolves in the way we have been trained to expect resolution, crime acknowledged, loss restored, justice visible and countable. That is not what happened here. What happened was something that requires more from the audience, because it requires more from everyone in it. Anthony did not get his money back. He will likely never get it back. Paul did not go to prison, and reasonable people can disagree about whether that is right. The yellow house is still on the ridge and someone else lives in it, and Angela has never once suggested she needs Anthony to fix that. What Anthony came home to was not the story he thought he was returning to. He came home to a mother who had spent 4 years solving a problem she had identified herself, with the resources she had available, without complaint and without announcement. He came home to a woman on cathedral steps who had given her name to a building she never asked for. He came home to a brother-in-law who had failed comprehensively and then, when offered a very small door back into usefulness, had walked through it without drama and kept walking. And he came home to the particular understanding that the most important things his mother had ever tried to teach him were not about the house on the hill. They were about what you do in the morning, whether you get up, whether you bring something, whether you sit beside the person who is eating alone. Angela Okafor had been practicing this lesson every day for 4 years at the base of a cathedral, in the presence of a woman whose name is now on a door. That is the inheritance Anthony actually received, not a balance in an account, not a deed to a property, a way of understanding what effort is actually for. The question this story leaves, the one that tends to stay with people, is not what Anthony should have done differently, or whether Paul deserved mercy. The question is simpler and harder than either of those. It is, what are you building? Not what are you planning to build when everything is settled, when the money is right, when the timing is better. Right now, with what you currently have, what is actually being constructed? Because Anthony came home with a fortune and found his mother on cathedral steps giving away her lunch, and the answer she had already built was better than the one he had carried 20 years to deliver. If that story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more of them, and they all end somewhere worth going.